Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Workplace Safety and Employee Re-Engagement Virtual Panel Discussion. My name is Lubna Araji, and I'm the Director of Executive and Professional Education at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. I will be your host today. In today's interactive panel discussion webinar, we will discuss the current challenges, solutions, and insights regarding your employees in the workplace. Topics like social distancing, dealing with the related HR issues, employee pre-existing health conditions, testing prior to entering the workplace, and other relevant health and safety questions will be explored. And today's webinar is co-hosted by Rutgers Executive and Professional Education and Competitive Business Solutions. So thank you for being here. The webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes. Everyone is muted, so please submit your questions via the WebEx questions box at any time. To share your questions or comments, you can use the chat or Q&A with the whole audience. Be sure to direct them to all participants. And for optimal viewing, it's best to select the grid view, which is at the top right-hand corner of your screen. We will leave time at the end for additional questions, but we will also be addressing any specific questions throughout the presentation. And this webinar is being recorded, and the link to the presentation will be sent to you via email. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ed Hoffman, President and founder of Competitive Business Solutions. Ed has an engineering and an MBA degree from Rutgers. He has served as a manager and director at GE and Lockheed Martin, and has launched his company, Competitive Business Solutions, in January 2000. And the company has served over 60 delivered services in more than 48 states and 9 countries, and has over 64 team members delivering their services. Ed, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Lubna. We are hosting this webinar with the purpose of sharing best practices and lessons learned. And to that end, we went and reached out and got what we think are the best of the best experts in their fields. And I want to take a short few minutes to introduce each one, and then we'll start with the questions. The first is Dr. Jeffery Hess. He joins us with over 37 years of combined experience in the fields of occupational medicine, aviation medicine, family medicine, and environmental health. Most recently, Dr. Hess has been the medical director for General Motors. You may have seen Dr. Hess. He's been featured on a number of news broadcasts as relates to bringing up the ventilator plant that GM retooled for. Dr. Hess is supporting opening many other GM facilities across the country. Prior to GM, Dr. Hess also was the medical director for Procter & Gamble of North America. But there's more to it. Dr. Hess also has 2 years experience with the CDC, a National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. He served a total of 22 years in the Ohio National Guard, 179th Medical Squadron, retiring as Chief of Aerospace Medicine and Director of Base Medical Services. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hess to our panel. Our second panelist is Professor Carmen Martino. He's the co-director of Rutgers Occupational Training and Education Consortium, also known as OTEC. He is an assistant professor at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. Professor Martino has provided technical assistance and strategic research to employers and community-based organizations at the national and local level. His expertise covers a range of topics that include strategic planning, root cause analysis, high performance work systems, and basic skills development and training. Carmen specializes in designing site-specific workforce development programs that build frontline leadership and organizational capacity. I very much would like to welcome Professor Martino to our panel today. Just before we get started, this is a panel format. We chose this to provide you with an opportunity to ask questions. I have a few prepared questions that I'll deliver to both Dr. Hess and Professor Martino, and then we will stop and we will ask the questions that you've submitted. So please pay attention to the comments and add questions into the panel discussion, as Bethany mentioned, and we will work through to ask those questions throughout the session. I'd like to stop at this point and turn it over to Dr. Hess, who has a few comments. And just to the panelists, if you can remember, please unmute your microphones.
Thank you, Ed. I think we all know that this COVID-19 has really turned our world upside down. At General Motors, our health teams are really focused on work injuries and occupational exposures and illnesses. We have workplace medical exams and do travel medicine and general safety and health. But, we're dealing with an infectious agent, or even this pandemic has really been something that's been out of the norm for us. So we've really had to focus on safety as a starting point for what we've been doing and what we plan to do moving forward. We've worked with internal and external experts to develop a really robust multi-layered protection approach, which is kind of custom tailored to most of our facilities, whether we're in the US, South America, or in Asia. The approach we've been using is been following things from the CDC and World Health Organization. We've tried to do best practices from our operations in China, which resumed operations shortly after the pandemic started, and then Korea, which actually never had to shut down their operations. They've been working through this pandemic. We've had lots of experts within our company who've been working within the safety, health, and HR, and other professionals at General Motors to help develop these workplace guidelines and employee guides that I've shared with the team, and I think you have access to on the GM website. So I look forward to talking to you about the pandemic and how we've tried to manage our system here and hopefully help others to do the same.
Thank you very much, Doctor. So let's jump right in with a few questions. The panel is set up that we will go back and forth between each of the panelists. I will ask that if you want to respond, please do. Just wait for the previous person to finish. And I'll start with you, Dr. Hess. So GM received appropriately a lot of very good publicity on the speed and effectiveness of standing up the GM ventilator plant known as Kokomo, taking an idle facility to building respirators in a very few short weeks. So this is really a two-part question. The first is, what were the more challenging aspects of this activity, specifically implementing a safe environment? And the second half is, as you're starting to open automotive plants, what practices have you made, or what changes have you made to your practices based on what you've learned from Kokomo? Thank you.
So, sure. I think that the key to understanding this one or responding to this is really knowing that before we shut down our operations in March, we were running behind the power curve, trying to do everything we could to protect our employees, to put pieces in place, to kind of put our fingers in the holes in all the dikes that were running around here. I mean, everything was leaking and ships felt like it was sinking. Once we were able to shut down, we were able to kind of regroup and look at everything that we were doing, start kind of doing a systematic approach on what is it we want to do? How can we protect our employees? What are the basic principles? And we kind of focused in on looking at really standard public health measures. Number one, we want to keep the disease out of the workplace. We want to stop the spread of the disease within the workplace. And then how do we manage employees who have symptoms who are in the workplace, or how can we help employees who have symptoms? We kind of use those as our framework to kind of develop our processes. And then we took our learnings from Korea and China and our other areas to kind of pull that together along with CDC and WHO to create our processes. So really the process we developed for Kokomo was our first iteration or reiteration of what we had been doing before on a kind of a scattered forefront, so that we were really actually ahead of the power curve, so that we could kind of sit back and start looking at, okay, where are our holes now? Where are the minimal places we need to do? Or what changes can we make to make the processes better? So it really was a team approach on making sure that we've got good public health measures in place. We understood what those are, and then put measures against each of those, as many as we could, to try and protect our employees. Going to the second piece, since we put those measures in place, we've actually had some really good success, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we've had some minor changes. We've maybe changed the health questionnaire we ask when people come into the plant. We've been modifying that several times throughout the last couple of months. We've added some cleaning processes. We're using some different chemicals now in our plants for disinfection. We're trying to manage some other pieces differently, but for the most part, the plan is pretty much the same. And the reason, or the thing I can tell you is that it does work. Putting these public health measures really do work. And the key to that is the fact that we've had a lot of individuals who, when we have someone has a close contact with somebody who has disease in our workplace, we send them home for 14 days. And we monitor that individual and make sure that to see if they come down with the disease. And so far, since we've implemented all our new processes, starting with Kokomo, and now with all of our plants, 60,000 people working across General Motors, we've not had any person-to-person transmission in any of our plants that we've seen. So I think that's a testament to the fact that the measures we put in place really do protect employees and help to make sure it's in a safe work environment.
Wow, that's a great result. And what I'd like to do is just leverage off of what you just discussed and maybe point a question towards Carmen. What are some of the other challenges or elements that people can do in bringing back people to other industries, service industries, construction, non-automotive, areas outside of Dr. Hess's areas of expertise?
So the challenges here are great, in part because employers are of varying sizes. For example, construction crews and residential construction are not always large. There may be subcontractors on site. In restaurants where we have slowly, depending upon what part of the country you're in, there's going to be a slow buildup back towards opening up restaurants slowly with fewer people starting. So the challenges are great. And I also think that to contrast with what the doctor just said about General Motors, a lot of the workplaces that we encounter through Rutgers historically, they don't have the systems of safety in place that you'll find at General Motors. So you have to start from a more direct sort of, the issue is COVID-19 and how are we going to address it? And so it's a matter of helping people develop some systems in a very rudimentary way. And at the same time, educating their employees and getting them to think through how they're going to address the problems in their workspaces. Now, I would just say that in construction, there's probably, in most cases, more of a history of people wearing PPE. So those situations, I think, are ones where it might be a little more conducive to educating employees and getting them to do whatever the policy is going to be around, for example, wearing face masks or respirators. But in other situations, other employers where people are not accustomed to wearing PPE historically, it's going to be a bigger challenge for them.
Thank you. Dr. Hess, maybe picking up on what the professor was just talking about, because the industries he's referring to has social distancing requirements, face masks, as you mentioned. How are you dealing with that at GM and places? I'm sure they have large cafeterias or common eating areas or conference rooms, both dealing with the social distancing and the face masks. Are there particular requirements that you've put in place, and how have you handled that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question because, you think about it, if you're wearing a mask all the time, you're working in the workplace, and we also have our employees wearing safety glasses so that, number one, it's a requirement in our factory, but number two, it helps keep disease particles from getting in your eyes. How do you do that when you go out and smoke? You got to take your mask off to do that. How do you eat when you're in the cafeteria or the break area, or even when you're taking a drink on the line? How do you do that? Well, I think we've really talked to our employees to let them know that we feel social distancing, keeping that 6-foot distance from each other, is really, really important. And we've stressed that time and time again. We've also stressed with them that there are times when you need to take your mask down, when you're going to be eating, when you're going to drink, or you're going to go take a smoke. make sure when you're doing that, that you're keeping the social distancing. So in our cafeterias, we have tables set up and there's the same number of chairs that used to be there, but some of the chairs are taped over or there's bags placed on those chairs to keep people from sitting in those. So we just ask employees that you may have to talk a little louder, when you're eating with your friends. It doesn't mean you can't eat with people, you can't converse, but you need to make sure you're keeping that social distancing so that those particles that are coming out of your mouth when you're eating and talking don't get into other people's faces and into their mouths. The other piece of this, though, is there are times when you can't not social distance, meaning you've got to be close together. You're doing a process that requires 2 people and you're going to be less than 6 feet from each other. That's where we really rely on the mask and the glasses, the safety glasses, to help protect our employees. So those times when you have to be together, that's where we're relying on our measures of making sure, number one, we've kept as many people out of the factory as we can that may have disease. Number two, if you did kind of bypass that and you're just starting to spread, this mask is going to really help contain those particles inside that mask, so you're not passing it to the person who's standing next to you. And the glasses kind of help with that. We do lots of cleaning in the factory. So you put all of those pieces together, this multifaceted approach, I think is what really helps to make sure that you're protecting people. So social distancing is important, but you can't just rely on that alone. And I think that's where we're at.
Thank you. So maybe just picking up on that theme a little bit on what you're asking the employees to do. And this is, for the most part, certainly the United States new for a lot of employees. You mentioned also doing work and Dr. Hess in other parts of the world where maybe wearing a mask and those kinds of things are more typical. So for this question is really for the professor in thinking about our workforce and our employees. How do you handle a situation or the problems where employees might not choose to wear a mask, where there's maybe in the employee handbook or the HR handbook, it's put in new practices as the doctor has mentioned, but some of the employees don't necessarily want to do that for one or a number of reasons. Is there any strategies that a company might use in order to encourage or handle that situation?
Well, I think this is the place where training and education is vital. And I think it's a place where there needs to be open lines of communication. And I think that it's also a matter of the employer also being aware of who the particular employees are. And I say that because I'm speaking a little out of my element here. The doctor or Jeff could certainly address this more than I can. But for example, there are people who have difficulties wearing masks because of other complications, other kinds of diseases or things that they have to contend with that make it difficult for them to wear a mask. And I can just tell you, even from my own personal experience, I'm 60 years old, and I started wearing a mask to take walks. And I started to notice after the first mile of walking, I started to feel a little more difficulty with breathing. And frankly, it became difficult for me to wear that mask. So I had to make some adjustments in order to do it. And in some cases, I take it off on my way around as long as I'm by myself and, there's no one around. It's not a public space. It's fine. But I say all that just by way of saying that, on the one hand, there needs to be good policy and procedures. There also needs to be good open lines of communication, training and education. All that stuff is vital. But then there needs to be a case-by-case approach to certain employees, I think, given what their circumstances may be.
That's great. And thank you for sharing that personal situation, because I experienced that when I bike ride. So
Okay, yeah.
Very, very uncomfortable. And the guidelines are changing. So this kind of ties to that situation where I think certainly more currently in the news, we're hearing opinions, I guess, from different health organizations as to what might not be happening and how to digest that information. So I think maybe both of you can address that particular question. When you start hearing different information, the WHO, for example, started talking about different particular transmittal guidelines and things like that. Where should people turn for their information? What should they rely on, particularly when it comes to opening up a workplace and providing direction. And we'll start with Professor. You kind of finished up, so I'll pick up with you, and then we'll move over to Dr. Hess.
Well, I think something we can talk about later, but I'll just put a little flag up right now. But one of the issues with regard to employment is around what employers' responsibilities are, and I just wanted to just flag that. I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the problems we have right now is that there isn't a standard that employers could look at and work off of and know and have some assurances that they're doing the right things in the workplace. So that makes it a little problematic, and we can come back to that standard stuff later. But otherwise, I think it's important to look at what is available, and the CDC is probably the best place to go. I think at this point, despite I know there are issues, politics that surround what's been going on, but the CDC has a long history of doing good work, and in this case, they're filling a huge void because, like I said, there isn't an OSHA standard, there isn't an emergency standard, so we're looking at what the CDC guidelines are. OSHA has, for the most part, followed up with those guidelines. And although they're not enforcing them, those are the recommendations that they're using. So I think first and foremost, what everyone can do is go to the CDC webpage and get there's a lot of information there. Most of the time it's written, maybe not exclusively in layman terms, but certainly in terms that most people can probably get a pretty good idea of what they need to know to be able to at least get a good start on what needs to be done in the workplace.
Thank you. Dr. Hess?
Yeah, I would very much agree. I mean, there's lots of information out there in the web if you look, and we get that from employees all the time on, I saw this and what about this, and this treatment's now new. And I always counsel them on, you really have to look at where your source is coming from, make sure it's valid, make sure it's real. But CDC, and I would agree, having had worked there in the past, it is a really good resource to go to. Obviously, though, even for the CDC, this is a new thing for all of us. Nobody really has answers. A lot of the things we're doing we're trialing things that make sense based on standard public health measures, but we don't know for sure. We don't know everything about this virus, how it transmits and everything. We feel that it's very airborne transmitted, very little contact transmission, meaning touching a surface and then touching your face to transmit, probably very low. But we don't have any good studies, no good scientific evidence that says that one way or the other. So a lot of this is trial and error. And so if you're going to do that, I would recommend you go with the best resources you can. And for US, CDC is it. If you're looking globally, you want something a little different perspective, WHO could be the next best thing to go to.
I want to leverage a little bit. Thank you, Doctor. I want to leverage a little bit about where you went with that answer. So because there's quite a bit of information out there and it can get confusing, it can create quite a bit of anxiety, certainly in general in the public and certainly with employees as you're trying to bring them back. So I'd like to direct this towards Professor Martino on how do you deal with bringing people back in a positive way? The employer opens up, they might have been out for 30 or 60 days, maybe longer. There's some anxiety. The workplace has been structured, looks different. How do you deal with them, the employees coming back, alleviating anxiety and helping them sort of re-engage in the workplace?
I would just go back. The first thing I would want to emphasize, I think, is that it's really important for the employers to have a good policy that's very clear and understood by all employees moving forward. And it's stuff that it needs to be developed before you start bringing people back. I think in situations where there are workplaces where our unions are representing the workforce, I think it makes more sense in those situations to have sort of a partnership as much as possible, where there's a good working relationship with the union and the employer and the employees, because then it makes for it gives employees a little more reassurance in those situations where they get union representation. And I think that all parties are better off if they're working together. Even if they have a long history of not working together, if they're working together on this issue around protecting employees from the virus, I think that's one good place to start. That helps employees. And the other thing I think that is really important here is, again, I go back to it depends. We want to have a policy in place that applies to everyone equally in a just and fair way. But then again, I also think it's important to look at each employee's situation, and psychosocial issues in the workplace, stress in particular, are something that is becoming more of a problem for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think the virus just kind of adds another layer on top of that. Workplace violence is another issue that I think of when I think about the stress in the workplace, those kinds of issues that have come up historically. But with the virus, it just brings a whole new dynamic to a problem that isn't going to go away. I guess that's the other thing. I think that it's going to be important to get across to employees is that we have a new world we're living in now. We're going to adapt to it. We're going to do our very best to protect you, and you need to do your part going forward and coming back to work. And again, I would just say that we have to look at each individual and look at their circumstance, each employee, to figure out what that might look like depending upon the circumstance.
Thank you. Dr. Hess, maybe along the same lines, GM is, of course, rapidly beginning to open their plants. Employees are coming in sort of with the same challenges. Has GM done anything along those lines to try to deal with employee re-engagement and anxiety that you might be able to share with us?
Most certainly. I think that in and of itself has been key to our success in being able to bring our employees back in an orderly fashion with very little hangups. And that has been communication. We communicate, meaning number one, we built the guides both for how the operations are going to work, but also the employee guide. We put that out. We've had things on Facebook. We routinely communicate with our employees through Facebook throughout this pandemic, letting them know, when operations were shut down, how long we thought we would be lasting in this situation, things that they could do to help themselves out. We put together videos and other things to kind of help employees understand things that they can do at home in order to protect themselves before they got in the workplace. And then when we started ramping up to get ready to start bringing employees back into the workplace, we had lots of videos, and some of them are even posted on our external website that kind of help employees understand, what are you up against? How are we protecting you? What are the things we're going to be doing? And then what's going to be the process? Then when we brought them in, the first day we actually didn't do any production. We educated them. We sat them down and had them understand the process. We really didn't expect to build any product that day. More so, we just thought we would get them in, get them comfortable, get them understanding all of our processes, how we're working to protect them, how safe the environment is compared to what you might find at Kroger's or at Home Depot, and let them experience it themselves so that the following day were comfortable coming in, ready to go, and willing to work because they felt safe. And I think that was key to us being able to push this through in a streamlined fashion and do it with flying colors.
That's great. We are at about almost 11:30, and what I'd like to do is move towards some of the participant questions and see what they have up on the board. They've been submitting questions to our team, and they've been going through and trying to reduce duplicates, and they forwarded them on to me. So I'm going to read through some of those questions. I think the first one is for Dr. Hess, and it has to do with coming back to work and PPE. I know personally when I was continuing to work at the beginning of this, PPE, hand sanitizers, those things were in very, very short supply. And yet we were still being asked to work. So the question is around whose responsibility is it to provide PPE? Is it the employer's responsibility? And specifically you're talking about GM, or does it rest with the employee?
I feel very strongly that this is an employer responsibility. I mean, ultimately, in anything we do, the employer is responsible for your employees' safety, making sure that your safety practices are in place, making sure that you're doing everything every day to make sure employees are safe, that the operations that are working are safe, and that nobody's going to get hurt or harmed. When the pandemic, I feel, is no different. I mean, you're asking people to come back into a work environment, and if you're not doing what you need to make them safe, then you're putting them at risk and your operations at risk. So at General Motors, we went out and scoured the world to try and find face masks for people. We really felt, while we could have used cloth masks, we really felt that a level 1, ASTM level 1 surgical type mask was probably the best way to go. So we went and we figured out how to make them. So we're making our own to provide to employees, but we also scoured the globe to find where we could find manufacturers. And luckily our joint venture partners in China also found this to be a helpful piece, and they were also making masks. So between them and what we are able to make, we're supplying masks to all of our employees. And I know that that can be a hardship for some smaller employers, but I really feel that, you know, if you're going to show your employees that you're trying to do everything you can to protect them, that's one measure you're going to have to go through. And whether it's cloth masks or whether it's a surgical mask, whatever it is you can do to protect them, I think you need it.
Thank you. This is sort of a similar question, and it's really for Professor Martino, and Dr. Hess, you can weigh in after this as well, because you may have the same sort of issue. How do you do, and it's particularly around face masks, how do you handle deaf employees who read lips? How do you handle essentially the PPE requirements of what needs to be done? So we'll start with the professor, and then we'll move over to Dr. Hess.
Well, there are laws that protect people with disabilities in this country. So I think part of what has to be, the employers have to be aware of, is that they have to do whatever they're required to do under the law for employees who have disabilities to begin with. This is an interesting question. And I think it's one that's going to be also have to be handled on a case-by-case basis. And I think, and one thing that I think is important here is that if it's about communication, and employees are going to have to communicate with each other, and an employee needs to read lips, then we have to, I think, practice all the other social distancing requirements that we can, where that is possible, to accommodate that person so that they can read lips and you can be far enough away to communicate with that person, for example. And there may be other situations that are going to have to be addressed to deal with someone who has a problem like that. But I think it's going to have to be thought of in a creative way, but be in a way that, again, meets the letter of the law in terms of a person with a disability. And I also think it's important, though, to be able to think creatively for each employee, given the job, given the actual work process, and how that might be able to be accommodated in a way that's going to be good for everyone. But I'm sure the doctor may have a better answer for this in some sense. I'm not sure. I'm going to put you on the spot, Jeff. I'm sorry.
It's okay. No,
Hey, it's questions from the audience. It is what it is.
So
Do your best.
I don't think there's a great answer for this. Obviously, there are some masks on the market that have a plastic component in the center of the mask that you can see through. So we've looked at those. They're very difficult to find. The manufacturer that makes the brand that I forget what the name of the brand is, but you know, they're kind of in short supply.
They fog up too, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, and they probably do.
Yeah,
they probably do. And so I think it goes back to standard safety practices again. There are other ways to communicate. And when you're working in an industry, you know that sometimes it's way too noisy to be able to communicate at all. So other employees have to figure this out, and you have to work with them to figure it out. So mask wear in our factories, in our facilities is required. So if you can't wear a mask, you can't come to work. That's pretty simple. That's where we've stated it. We say it's a safety practice and we're done. Now we will work with employees as much as we can to try and find ways around that if they're having difficulty wearing the mask, or, you know, in this case, if somebody's deaf or has, you know, has to read lips in order to communicate, we'll work with them to figure out other ways we can get communication across. And in our processes, usually we've been able to deal with that for quite a few times. So it's just a matter of working with the employee, trying to look for new solutions, unique solutions, and seeing what you can work with. But you have to listen to the employees too, because sometimes they've got great ideas on how to fix these and help you get through that, get over that hump.
Is there, so this question, maybe I'll start with you, Jeff, because you're dealing with GM, and then move over to Professor Martino. Employees who refuse to come back to work for one reason or another. It could be a dear friend of mine, husband, is going through chemotherapy and feels that he's very much at risk, or maybe they have a personal reason on their own, whether it's anxiety or else, just refuse to come to work. Does GM have a particular way of handling that, or how are they dealing with that? And that may or be not within your area of responsibility. If it is, we'd be interested in hearing it. And then I'd be interested in moving that same question over to Professor Martino.
And I think that's a very good question, because there are lots of reasons why employees may not be able to come to work. So our HR and labor relations group has really worked hard to make sure that we can accommodate employees to the extent where it's possible. So number one, from our standpoint, we really feel that after we put our protection measures in, and with the data we have right now, that our facilities are probably actually safer to be in than they are other than your home. They're probably the safest place to be at. So for employees who may have an underlying health condition that, should they develop COVID, might have complications, we don't necessarily count that as being a issue, meaning we wouldn't put them on disability or something like that because they can't come to work. There are other processes we put in place to be able to cover those individuals. For individuals who have immunocompromised or other issues, if we feel that we need to protect them more, we might put them in an N95 mask, or we might, if the situation is such where they're actively getting chemotherapy or they're having health issues, we might actually put them out on disability because of that factor. Going back to those individuals then who can't get a medical restriction in order to be able to help accommodate them, HR and LR has several processes in place where they'll allow you to take vacation time. They'll work with you to take unpaid leave. You can take FEMLA. You can ask for some special dispensations. So we will hold your job. We'll try and do what we can to keep you whole through this process to the extent that they're able to. So HR has developed a lot of processes to help our employees and make sure that, depending on whether you don't want to come to work just because you don't feel it's safe, all the way to the fact that you may have a sick person at home, family member who you need to take care of, or who you are afraid might bring the disease back to, there are processes in place and to be able to help support you and to keep you out if you need to stay out.
That's great, thank you. Professor Martino, any additional comments on that?
The only thing I would just add to that is the Family First Corona Response Act, which allows people who get sick to go home and get paid for, I think, a couple of weeks' pay, is important for people who are sick and obviously can't come to work. And I think Jeff also had mentioned the Family Medical Leave Act as another possibility here for people to help accommodate folks who are having difficulties of one sort or another, either themselves or with family members. So yeah, I think you pretty much covered most of it.
Great, thank you. What I'd like to do is move over to communications. And I just want to remind the participants, as you're listening, please continue to ask questions. We're going to stop one more time before the end and try to pose those questions to the panelists as well. One last question that came in before I jumped to communications was regarding after the webinar, can we follow up with information regarding protective items and I'll say specific requirements regarding disinfection and chemicals, those kinds of things. We have a copy of the General Motors guidelines that we are going to be forwarding out to those who participated in the panel discussion, and we'll send that out with a follow-on email. So thank you very much for that question. There's a lot of great.
You could also add there that the CDC has a long list of stuff about disinfectants and how to go about applying that stuff there on their page. So that's another place you can get some of that information.
I would say you go to the EPA website. They've got a great list of all the chemicals that are approved to combat COVID. They list contact time, so how much time do you have to leave the substance on the surface to kill the virus. So it's a great resource and can be very helpful.
And we'll send those specific links out to make it easy for you to find. So let's kind of move to communications. And what we're doing is kind of moving up one level and kind of thinking about when GM had to get started and thinking about the bringing up this ventilator plant and reopening factories, there must have been quite a bit of leadership and management discussion on getting started in this area. So did General Motors create any sort of councils or processes to help get all this organized? If you could just talk us through, Dr. Hess, how did GM get organized so rapidly? What did they put in place to do that so they can move so quickly in both standing up that ventilator plant and now reopening plants around the country?
Sure. I think, again, there's this pre-shutdown and post-shutdown scenario. The pre-shutdown, we have an emergency response team pretty much at every plant across the globe, and they come into action whenever there's an issue or something that might disrupt manufacturing, so we can focus on it and get it solved. And we were using them pretty much consistently, and kind of got different responses at every site. So once we got to the shutdown, we pretty much took a step back and said, okay, it's time to put together a leadership team that can kind of help focus on this, make some decisions. So we put together a team that had medical on it and safety. We had industrial hygienists on there. We had leadership, communications, HR, pretty much anything you could think of, external government relations, et cetera, so that we could start looking at this from a holistic approach and start saying, okay, now here's our process. How are we going to get this implemented at the site? How are we going to train our employees? How are we going to communicate with the community? So we kind of used that as the approach. And then there was lots of sub-teams that would go out and do specific projects. So for our temperature scanning systems, we had to learn how to use those. We had to develop kind of work processes on how you set it up. How do you calibrate it every day or every shift to make sure that you're hitting that right number of people who might be positive and sending them down to the health center to have them checked, have their temperature rechecked. So we had small sub-teams that were working constantly to develop things. Even there was a team that developed the guides that you'll send out. We had sub-teams that were working on those. So it was kind of a team of teams approach, meaning we had the centralized team that was kind of working on all the ideas, and then we had sub-teams working on the finished products and materials to put out for our teams.
Of the sub-teams, which ones, if you can recall, were sort of the most challenging? Which ones seem to have sort of the biggest oars to pull and try to resolve the biggest issues?
Really, I think the biggest issues were resolved at our larger team, meaning what processes are we going to put in place? What measures are we going to use to protect our employees? You know, there was a lot of debate on how we were going to implement this and what practices to follow in. And most of the individuals are not versed in medicine. So from my perspective, it was very simple, very straightforward. It was a lot of education and training for those individuals to understand the practices of medicine, and that medicine really is an art, not a science, meaning, you know, you sometimes you kind of do stuff from the, you know, shooting from your hip, and it either works or it doesn't work, and then you change direction and try something new. For a manufacturing environment that's used to control, that's very difficult to come. So I would say that was probably the most challenging team for me. The other teams, I think, really had direction. I mean, they knew what they had to produce. They knew what outcomes they needed. So it was a lot easier for them to operate.
So it was dealing with the uncertainty became sort of the challenge.
Exactly. Uncertainty is definitely the key to this whole COVID-19 pandemic.
So I want to stay on communications. Professor, you brought this up as well quite early in the discussion, the importance of communications. And I recall in numerous jobs that I've been on, as well as consulting engagements, there's always sort of the formal and informal channels of communication. And in fact, in many companies, there's multiple formal channels of communication. If there's a labor or different types of communications coming up through your workforce, they have certain positions, management have certain positions. So this question really is around how do you balance those communication channels? Are there particular strategies that can be used to make, I think both of you would agree, the communication at this point coherent, clear, definable, yet they're coming up two different channels. So Professor, from your standpoint, are there some best practices there to bring that communication together so people are hearing the same message?
Yeah. So actually, if I could, and I want to tie it to what you just asked me, but when Jeff was describing General Motors, I couldn't help but think how much of what goes on at General Motors is not that it's predetermined, but there's something that we describe as a culture of safety that exists in a workplace to one degree or another. At General Motors, it's very high. This culture of safety is integral. It's been there for a very long time. In a lot of workplaces, the culture of safety is lacking, right? And because it's lacking, there's not a lot of awareness around the issue of safety generally and health and safety in the workplace. So it's going to be more difficult and more challenging in workplaces where there's not a foundation of safety in that workplace. And communications actually is a system of safety. It's one of the important systems of safety. So I think that if employers are going to, if we're going to try to get improved communication, employers need to think in terms of taking a systems approach. And it's not that complicated. You can develop a systems approach to safety in the workplace and focus in on, on things like design. You focus in on things like policy, procedures, mitigation devices. It's pretty simple stuff, generally speaking, that you start with, but then you have to be able to develop policies and procedures that support that system of safety and provide the training that's going to allow people to be able to communicate with each other. Because I think personally that that's the place to begin if you are starting from a place where there's not historically been a lot of communication, and now you're trying to bring workers back in the context of the virus. You need to develop a training program where there's equity in that training, and the workers have a good sense that they can talk freely without worrying about something happening that I said in the meeting that's going to cost me outside the meeting. So there needs to be some trust. There needs to be some encouragement, supporting people and giving people a sense that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to give information, and we're all in this to solve this problem and try to make the workplace safer. So. But that's it. I'm talking about workplaces where there isn't a culture of safety or not much of a culture of safety, or there hasn't been a history of health and safety in that workspace. And there obviously needs to be.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is just take a pause here. We have some more questions that have come in. I'd like to pose those. We're at about 11:45 or so. I'll point this one first towards Jeff, and then we'll come back to you, Carmen. The first one is, do you still check persons' temperatures daily?
We do. It's part of our entry process. So again, one of the keys is to keep the disease out. So we check temperatures every day. While the outcome, the number that we catch is very small, it really does keep employees reminding them every day that I'm sick, I should be home anyway. So should I be here? And it really does help highlight that. So I think it has dual benefit of, it may catch somebody who has a high temperature, but it also is reminding employees that we are very focused on trying to make sure this place stays safe. And if you're not feeling well, you need to stay home.
I think I'll follow that up. There's sort of a natural next question, which is, can you discuss requiring employees to submit for COVID-19 testing?
Sure. Obviously, you cannot, or we don't feel we can force any employees to be tested. Part of our managing employees who are symptomatic approach is that we offer testing. We have it available. We contracted with a national lab to provide testing, so we can actually do the sample in our health center and send it off and know within 24 to 48 hours whether somebody's positive or not. We can do that, and we offer that to employees when they come to us and they have symptoms or they have concerns, or if they're at home, we can bring them in and get them tested. So it's part of that protecting, helping our employees when they're symptomatic. And it goes along, same thing, if any of those are positive or we're concerned with the symptoms they have, we'll do contact tracing at that time also to make sure that we're checking for any employees that might be in the workplace that we may need to send home because they may have had a close contact.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow up another sort of more medical directed question, which is, what, if anything, is GM doing on contact tracing?
So like I said, contact tracing falls into that last category again of trying to help manage symptomatic employees. So we actively, whenever an employee comes down with symptoms or we hear of them having a positive test, we will look back 48 hours to see who they may have come in close contact with. That would be, we kind of follow CDC guidelines as a starting point, meaning who have you been with closer than 6 feet from each other for 15 or more minutes? Or somebody who did you eat lunch with? That might be another question, because obviously your mask can be down. Who did you go out with a smoke with in the last 48 hours before symptoms started, so that we can kind of identify who might be a close contact. The CDC and WHO have some really good guidelines on how to do contact tracing. There's some trainings that you can go to, and it really can help a workplace to identify that. But you really need to be careful, because you can't release it's releasing medical data if you tell somebody that somebody's positive. You have to be very careful in those realms. So we ask the individual who has the symptoms to tell us who they were close contact with. When we find out that they are positive, we send the individuals who they've mentioned home. We just tell them that they had a close contact in the workplace, and we can't tell them who that individual is. If the person who is sick chooses to tell them, that's fine, but we can't release that information.
Okay, great. I'd like to follow up the last question we have from one of the participants for Carmen. Carmen mentioned a COVID protection bill giving people 2 weeks with conditions to be home. Does this apply also to homes with 2 working adults when their childcare options are no longer available for whatever reason?
I'm going to be quite straightforward and honest with you. I am not sure about that. I don't want to try to make something up that I don't know the answer to. I have colleagues at Rutgers who are better versed on the legality of the legislation and what people's options are. So I would prefer to not be answering that one directly at this point, because I'm not sure.
Okay, well, that's why we have Rutgers participating. So maybe we can go do a little bit of research and put a response out to the individual asking that question. The final one is also for Carmen. What changes might be required in the standard training program? What might an organization have to adjust to make it effective in today's environment?
For years, the training that we have done has always been based on a participatory model. In fact, we take it to the level of we train workers to be worker trainers. So it's a peer-based model of training. And what we try to do is allow for and encourage people to have an open line of communication. And by putting people in the front of the room who are like the people in the audience, that tends to give people some reassurance that they can have that kind of communication. But in the absence of training workers to be worker trainers, we encourage the kind of training that allows people to do problem solving, group problem solving. We'll put people in small groups. We give them a problem to solve. We give them data, information, facts to back up or allow them to be able to make a decision about a problem with some information attached to it. So they can be informed about the decisions that they're making. And we try to develop training programs that are real life, meaning that they're, when we give people the problems to solve in the workspace, in the training, that they're problems that actually do exist in the workplace. So it's a way of giving everyone an opportunity to become the problem solver, to take some ownership over the problem themselves and to solve it themselves. And we've always found that when you do that, you create an environment where you can get at some of that stuff we were talking about earlier about better communication and being able to have some assurance that everybody understands the policy and the procedures that are in place. But again, it goes back to this very participatory model. It's peer-based problem solving and group problem solving is probably the best way to go about doing it.
Thank you. So we're going to move towards now closing out the webinar with a couple of wrap-up questions that I think are really important because it brings this to a summary, and then we'll provide some additional information before we close out. So the first one for you, Dr. Hess, what are 2 key lessons learned that you'd like to share with the audience as we bring this webinar to a close?
I think that the 2 key things I would mention is that, number one, a strong team can really make the process work really well. Making sure you've got either within your company, if you have the resources, or if you don't have the resources, look for them in the community. There's lots of occupational medicine medicine physicians, physicians in the community, medical professionals in the community that can probably help you put together a plan that can meet your needs and help your employees. But the key piece I would say here is communication. You've got to communicate often, educate as much as you can, make sure that you do that on a consistent basis to be successful.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor Martino, where can people go to seek additional information in regards to bringing employees back to work safely? You mentioned a few earlier. Maybe you could just provide a summary of that and any other key piece of information you'd like to share.
So I think bringing people back safely. There are, if you go to the CDC page, OSHA has some information to back up some of that stuff. I think it's important to go to OSHA anyway to take a look at what they've got. I would also say that some of the sites you can go to online, some of the human resource sites are pretty reputable, do a pretty good job of explaining process and in terms of how you bring people back safely. And I think those are the places that I would go first.
Are there any particular sites that you would point them towards?
Well, I could say you could. I forget, it's the human resources page, SHRM, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember right now. I don't. Hold on, let me see.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is SHRM.
They're usually pretty reliable in terms of giving you some direction, and they have spaces on there where you can go get more information from other pages. So that's one place I think I would assume safely that you could get good information.
That's great. So that concludes the question and answer, but not the information, the balance of information we'd like to share. So I'd like to turn it over to Lubna, if you're available to talk about some of the information. And I'd like to also talk a little bit about competitive business solutions.
Can you see my screen, Ed?
Yes.
Okay, so please go ahead.
Okay, so just closing out, it's with great pleasure that I was able to facilitate and moderate this panel discussion. What we're trying to do within CBS, our firm, is a learning series, which is really a knowledge sharing, attempt to share information from one industry or one company to another and bring together both industry, academic, and where the opportunity applies, bring in also legislative and government for topical areas. And workplace safety at this point is probably number one on our list, making sure everyone stays safe. And as a company, that's just one element that we do. We have consulting services. We're based in New Jersey, and we provide services in operational excellence, supply chain transformation, acquisition integration, which is our private equity support, along with program project management and leadership and change management. And learning and problem solving, as Professor Martino mentioned, and as Dr. Hess mentioned, the constant moving and changing of what we're learning is what we're all about. Solving problems, sharing information, and helping companies become successful and profitable for long-term growth. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Lubna.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Dr. Hess and Professor Martino for joining us today. Before we close, I just wanted to give the attendees some information about the certificate programs that the School of Management and Labor Relations offers in terms of executive and professional education. So we have a certificate program coming up in September. It's called HR for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's usually an in-person program, but we have switched to the online offering now, and we will have 10 half-day online workshops. It's on Thursdays, and what participants get are 30 business recertification credit hours through HRCI and 30 professional development credits through SHRM. And for people who are interested in getting their master's in human resource management, they can get a 3-credit elective course waiver. And in this certificate program, some of the topics we cover include aligning business and HR strategy, implementing change in your organization, leveraging talent analytics and artificial intelligence. And the other certificate program I wanted to talk about is Leader's Edge. It's a similar format. It also starts in September, and it provides 30 business recertification credit hours through HRCI. And in this certificate program, we cover topics such as improving ability to execute strategy, implement change, build confidence through executive presence, build and lead high-performing teams, and other topics such as fostering culture, a culture of innovation. And next week, we actually have a 2-hour online workshop where Dr. Jessica Methat dives really deep into how to jumpstart your professional networks. So take advantage of this offering. And the following week, we will have another panel discussion around HR for the 4th Industrial Revolution that will be led by our chair of the Department of HR Management and our distinguished faculty members. So yes, thank you again to our panelists and our moderator, and thank you, CBS. If you would like to get more information about CBS capabilities, please reach out to them. You have the information here. And if you want additional information about our executive and professional education programs, reach out to me or Bethany Dennis, or check out our website for all the webinars we have presented so far and the upcoming ones. Thank you again and have a great day. Bye.